everyone. Welcome to this week's China in the News. I am Christine Ying. Join me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Doug Guthrie. Before we jump into today's topic, I want to share an exciting change with you. After nearly 20 episodes of China in the News, we decided it's time to broaden our scope. I work as a software product manager in Silicon Valley, and through my work in international markets, I developed a strong interest in global issues. Doug, with his decades of experience in global management and leadership development, bring deep expertise in this area. Together, we feel a responsibility to explore the world's most pressing challenges from a broader perspective. Starting next week, we are excited to launch Global Lens, Conversations with Professor Doug Guthrie. While we're being deeply involved and focused on China, this new series will expand our coverage to global issues from geopolitics to technology, trade, and leadership through the lens of moral responsibility and the long-term impact of today's most pressing challenges. We're really thrilled for this next chapter and hope you will join us on the journey. Doug, could you give us a preview of what's to come as we broaden our exploration of global challenges with a focus on moral leadership?
Well, thank you, Christine. It's so great to be here talking to you again. As always, I just so look forward to our conversations and to exploring the important and interesting, and sometimes exciting and sometimes terrifying trends in the world right now. You and I are both China scholars and China experts, and we've kind of grown up in the field that way. If to take my own story back many, many, many years, I fell in love with China as an undergraduate college student at the University of Chicago in the late 1980s, and thought a lot about the Chinese language, literature, and history. I started studying Chinese in 1989, in the fall of actually it was the fall of 1988, but in 1989, the Tiananmen movement happened, and my attention was captured. I was just so entranced by this idea of like, this isn't just a story about Chinese language, literature, and history and great Chinese poets and, literature and history going back thousands of years. It's also a story of the most populous nation on earth as it transforms itself. And it was at that time, as you know, that I went off. I took a year of leave absence from the University of Chicago and went to live in Taiwan, where I could continue to learn the language and literature, but from a first-person basis. And then I came back to the United States and was both in love with Chinese language, literature, and history, but also in love with economic development and change. And so as I grew in my career, I started to study the Chinese economy and thought about the dramatic transformations that were happening there, and became a young China scholar at New York University. But eventually I was still thirsty. I didn't want to just be a China sociologist or a Chinese economic sociologist of China. I wanted to teach people. I wanted to be in the business school world. And so at that time, I visited a number of different business schools, and I started to move into the Stern School of Business and really kind of think deeply about how we could together think about China's economic development, but also how we think about what that economic development means for things like moral leadership in the world. One of the things that's funny about being a business school professor is you can't just be a China scholar. You have to think deeply about where you fit and what you're doing, and which functional area do you sit in. And so being in the business school world, you have to choose, like, are you a strategy person? Are you a finance person? Who are you? And just because my work was so much about economic development and strategic change, and helping companies navigate China's complex landscapes, I got fit into the management and leadership department. And, there, Christine, I fell in love with the field of leadership. I so enjoy thinking about how to train young people, but also very senior leaders, about how to be good leaders and how to think strategically. But it's not just about strategic thinking and how you build a strong, effective organization. It's about moral leadership. What we are doing in the world matters, right? Like, the company that you and I worked for, overlapped for some time, Apple. What Apple does in the world matters, right? And what companies like TSMC do in the world matters. And the positions that we take on moral leadership really matter for how we think about just global economic change, sustainable development, how we treat labor fairly. All of these things matter. But to even go a step beyond China and joint ventures in China, what's happening in the geopolitical stage right now is a leadership situation, also, dare I say, perhaps a leadership crisis. We have a lot of people that are just making decisions that seem to be tied to, paying 250 million to get the person elected who can give him the biggest tax cuts. These are moral leadership questions and issues. And so, as you and I and the rest of the OGL team have talked about this, we've said, yeah, it's great to be China scholars and it's great to talk about these issues and to help the world understand China. And I love the work we've done on China in the news. But I think we all agreed, and you pushed us as hard as anyone on this, is we need to take strong positions on these issues. So this can't just be about our economic analysis of China, our analysis of China in the news, and our analysis of what good leadership means for different corporations and universities. It also is what good leadership means for people at the highest end of the spectrum, like the President of the United States and the chairman of the party in China, but also for people like you and me, who are very low on the totem pole in terms of our immediate effect, but who step up and let our opinions be known. That's leadership too. And so I'm really excited about this new path, Christine, and I want to thank you for pushing us down this road.
Well, thank you, Doug. Just let the audience, we'll continue to cover China with our global lens.
Of
So
course.
now let's turn to this week's China focus updates. First, let's start with a troubling and bold statement from Beijing. China recently declared that it's ready for any type of war with the United States. This include economic battles like tariff and trade wars, or possibly military conflicts. Doug, what does this rhetoric signal about the current state of U.S. China relations?
So, Christine, I have to say it's as things get heated up between China and the United States, it saddens me, and I'm going to hesitate to use the word devastated, but I'm very, very worried and concerned. And this is rhetoric that's coming from both sides now, right? And um, if we go back in time to when Deng Xiaoping came to visit Jimmy Carter in 1979, China was a country that had been through a very, very difficult period for many, many years, for more than a century. I mean, the century of humiliation goes back to 1895 with the fall. Well, that was the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War, and then the fall of the Qing Dynasty, and then the warlord period, and then the terrible famine of the early communist period. And when Deng Xiaoping got on a plane and came to normalize relationships between the United States and China, it was a country that was hurting, right? It was the largest population in the world, but there were 800 million people living in abject poverty, and maybe 500 million. Some people would estimate that didn't have enough resources for food every day, right? And so Deng Xiaoping was opening the country up and saying we're open for business, money that can flow in. We have a big, cheap labor force, et cetera, et cetera. And we saw that happen for about a decade. Still, there was tension, right? There was tension around issues like, we saw the rise of the Democratic Progressive Party. And we saw kind of strong tensions around issues like Taiwan. And, we're going to, I think, talk about Taiwan a little more in this discussion. But like this relationship, this sort of post World War II, and then sort of post Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping relationship, as one of the key things that happened with Deng Xiaoping was the normalization of relationships and the understanding that there is but one China and Taiwan is a part of China. Now, we saw Congress in the United States sort of step up and flex its muscles a little bit. Most people don't realize that right in the wake of Jimmy Carter signing the bill or shaking hands with Deng Xiaoping and agreeing that this was going to happen, then Congress passed something called the Taiwan Relations Act, which basically said that the United States was going to continue to fund Taiwan's military. And that was, an interesting thing in the wake, and President Carter vetoed that bill. But it was a veto-proof bill. Now, so in the United States, the way democracy works is if you have a two-third majority in the House and Senate, you can pass things that you want. And so we've been living in this sort of crazy dynamic, or this interesting dynamic of just what the relationship is. But still, China was a developing nation. Now, in the 90s, China started to develop much more aggressively and strongly and look like more of a power position in the global political economy. President Clinton helped with the China engagement. Uh, resolutions and helped pave the way for China getting into the World Trade Organization in 2001. And then we sort of saw China continue to develop, and it was a pretty good relationship because the company you and I worked for entered China under Tim Cook's leadership in 2001, and Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao were pretty, laissez-faire players, and they wanted to see China's economy develop, and they wanted to continue to just be a part of things. Now, you and I have also discussed China has always been a little bit angry about, I don't know if I should impute that, but it's been very clear in the work that I've done that China's never enjoyed the idea that they didn't get a seat at the big table, right? There's the G7, and China, you can be at the kids' table, the G20, and it's okay. Like, you're just a developing nation, and we are the ones that hold the cards. And as you and I have discussed previously, there was a while that people were saying, well, this is because this is capitalist democracies. But we know that's not true because they let Russia into the G7 and made it the G8 in 2008. And then they kicked Russia out because of the invasion of Crimea in 2013. But all of this is leading up to Xi Jinping coming to power in 2013, and really a stronger stance that China is one of the most powerful economies in the world. Back in the Xi Jinping era, it was definitely the second largest economy in the world, but still a big distance behind the United States. But it's continued to grow at strong rates, and it's going to take its position, I believe, as the largest economy in the world, probably in the next 5 to 6 years, right? It also has the largest military in the world, right? And if you just look at people who are active military bodies on the ground, China has the largest military. The United States has the third largest, and Russia's in there, and there's a couple of other players in that top 5 or 6 group. And so, China's a powerful nation, and it thinks of itself as a very influential nation. We've also seen the reformulation of the BRICS coalition. And so we see this, pivoting away. This isn't just about China, building the Belt and Road Initiative and trying to build new markets. This is about China being a leader in the global South and building its relationship with India, and really kind of thinking about the Brazil, Russia, India coalition. I mean, this is a really powerful moment. And so, as we've kind of seen things heat up, starting in 2016 with the first Trump administration, there was a lot of bluster about trade, a lot of tough talk. Then there were formal tariffs that came in play in 2018. I sort of thought that things would be dialed back with the Biden administration, but we didn't see a lot of that. And I think China is continuing to grow and sort of sense that if you're going to talk tough with us and talk tough about things like tariffs and create a real trade war, and this is where this sort of amazing statement comes, we're ready for any kind of war. And this isn't just a trade war. You want a trade war? We'll give you a trade war. And as you know, Christine, in my opinion, China wins that war. We are not in a position to just have tariffs that increase prices for U.S. consumers so that we can rebuild manufacturing supply chains in America. That will take 20 years, and we are not in the position to do that. And some of our most valuable companies like Apple and Tesla and Walmart, are so heavily dependent on China that China wins the trade war. But the fact that this statement wasn't just a trade war, we're ready for any kind of war, I think is also a hidden signal that we're not going to be pushed around, and the issue of Taiwan is going to be a very real issue, and Taiwan is a part of China, and so we're going to continue to really stake out a strong position on this. And so I think sorry for the very long-winded answer, Christine, but I think that this is a scary moment. It's a remarkable moment, and I think to go back to how we're changing the focus of what we're doing together in these conversations, it requires better moral leadership. It requires people who are people like the President of the United States, and maybe the hidden hand behind the presidency, Elon Musk, and maybe people like Secretary Rubio. It requires people to step up and be responsible in their rhetoric on how they think about things. Because if we want to get into a trade war, an economic Cold War, or something that leads to sort of stronger military stances, China's not going to back down. That's my prediction.
Well, thanks. We talked a lot in previous episode about tariffs. So let's dig down into the other type of war. So intelligence reports have continued to emphasize that China remains the top military and cyber threat to the United States. They highlight Beijing's ability to strike with conventional weapons, as well as compromise U.S. infrastructure through cyber attacks. How serious is this threat? And what does it mean for U.S. national security?
I mean, it's extremely serious. China's military advancements combined with other cyber capabilities, it gives them a unique ability to challenge the United States on multiple fronts, right? And so, again, if we just think of like, oh, China, that's that place of cheap labor where all of those light industry goods that are sold in Walmart are made, that's not the story anymore. Like this story is about some of the most aggressive developments and really innovative developments. I mean, you and I have discussed the issue of DeepSeek in the past, and there's a lot going on here. So cybersecurity in particular is an area where the U.S. is vulnerable because China is zooming ahead in this area, and they're very, very powerful in what they're able to do, but also, they're going to get as much information as they can in thinking about how to do things, and they're going to protect their own infrastructure, both physical and digital. And us protecting our own infrastructure in the United States must also remain a top priority. So this is a really, I think it's a really critical issue to think about. This isn't just about, the size of your conscripted labor force, but also this is about things like cybersecurity. And so, yeah, I think it's a really, really critical issue to think about and to think deeply about, Christine.
Thanks. Well, the sticking point between the United States and China, as always, will remain to be Taiwan. Recent reports suggest that China is prepared to blockade the island, which could lead to a significant escalation of the relationship. So, Doug, what would a move like this mean for cross-strait relations and regional stability in Asia?
Well, I mean, you and I have talked about this before, but I want to just go on the record of saying this. I mean, just based on what I know and the people I know within the Chinese government, um, under Xi Jinping, it will not happen that Taiwan will be allowed to kind of continue down a road towards independence. This is a very, very critical issue. And again, this goes back to, as I was talking about in my opening comments, this goes back to the tensions around this issue between Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter, but then the Taiwan Relations Acts. And so it's always been a murky space. And Taiwan has been an innovative gem in the manufacturing sectors and development of East Asia. Right? I often tell my classes when we're talking about this, because they're many times too young to remember things like the when we used to call the developing Asian areas of East Asia the NICs, and it was because that means newly industrialized countries, and that
Oh,
was South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And then
they're
there's
called
this
the Four Tigers when I was growing up in
uh,
Taiwan,
also called the Four
or
Tigers.
Asian Tigers.
But in academic literatures, they were called the NICs. And then we realized at some point we weren't allowed to say NICs because Taiwan and Hong Kong are not countries. So we need to say the NIEs, the newly industrialized economies. And so over here in the sort of popular literature, it was the Four Tigers. But over here in the academic literature, we were still having this debate in the late 1990s. Can we say NICs? No, you can't. And so this has been a part of the discussion, again, for 30 plus years. And so the idea that China's just going to let this go is just wrong. It's not. And so we've seen sort of growth and engagement on this issue over the course of the 2000s because we saw Taiwan develop as a true economic power and a truly innovative economic power. And we don't see just companies like Foxconn that's assembling Apple iPhones. We also see important companies uh, like TSMC, right? I mean, TSMC is probably the most important and innovative maker of semiconductor microchips in the world, right? And so, like, how we're thinking about this is really critical for this integrated system. But I think the more that language, now it seemed like under Chen Shui-bian and the Democratic Progressive Party's rise in the 1980s and early 1990s, things were tense, but China was still sort of digging its way through things. It seemed like things had been sort of taken a step back, and Tsai Ing-wen seemed like she was very much about engagement and like, let's continue to find a smooth path to this solution. The new president Lai is, it's been a much more aggressive. I mean, he's a DPP guy, and it's been a much more aggressive conversation. And I think, again, the leadership of China is just not going to let it sit by the wayside and kind of evolve into something where some signals are given that Taiwan may be on a path to independence. And so I think building up things like military presence in the Taiwan Strait and maybe even the threat of a blockade, this stuff is serious, but it's real. This is happening.
So, for our audience, DPP stands for Democratic Progressive Party. They are
Correct.
Minjingdang. They are a center-left Taiwanese political party that the color is green, and they're currently the ruling party in Taiwan. Okay, so on a related note, I have seen a really interesting trend on TikTok, or social media in general. Um, Videos of Taiwanese individuals publicly declaring their loyalty to mainland China. These clips appear suspiciously timed, raising questions about a possibility of a state-sponsored propaganda. Coincidentally, on Tuesday, March 25th, Taiwan also deported a Chinese woman named Yaya. She has a Douyin account called Yaya in Taiwan. She's been in Taiwan for about a decade, married to a Taiwanese national. And she was praising Beijing's military ambition to conquer the island. So, all these together, Doug, does this seem like a coordinated propaganda effort? What do you think of China's goal in promoting these videos?
Well, so just to be clear on one thing, um, I want to just carefully address the issue of a coordinated propagandistic endeavor, because that may signal to listeners, or maybe even to me as I think about that means that there's the black hand of the Beijing government that's behind this whole process, which could be true, right? That's sort of one far end of the spectrum, that the Beijing government is having people produce these videos and then they're putting them on their these very popular platforms that are seen all around the world. And so it could be a propagandistic campaign. That being said, I do want to be a little bit careful. Yes, it is true that President Lai is out of the Democratic Progressive Party. And yes, there is has been a somewhat tense relationship between the Democratic Progressive Party and the Kuomintang, right? But for 40 years, the Kuomintang ruled was the ruling party in Taiwan, and there are still many people who maybe don't like to affiliate themselves either with Kuomintang or with DPP, but they want to see unification, right? And so I think here, for example, one of the great mentors in my academic life when I was very young, I had a Taiwanese roommate named Liu Shu. His father was a very famous China scholar. They were from Taiwan, and he was a very famous China scholar named Xu Zuoyun. And he was sort of an ancient history China scholar. But when had questions about the Tiananmen movement or about Taiwan, or I would go to Leo, and Leo would put me in touch with his dad, and so Leo's dad, Leo's dad was a great China scholar. He was a scholar for many, many years at the University of Pittsburgh, and was a fairly eminent scholar in the sort of thinking about Taiwan's role in the world, but China's role in the world. And so, and he would have never identified as a DPP person. He was firmly a believer in his Taiwanese identity. Um, but like there's a significant number of people like that in Taiwan who believe in the unification with the mainland, and who believe in the idea of, and so I want to be careful that yes, it could be the hand of Beijing behind the scenes, paying people to create these videos, or asking certain people to create these videos and putting it in very propagandistic space to kind of create this notion of a continuing merging. But there are people in Taiwan who think that way as well.
But the timing is suspicious. I've all of a sudden see that in the last month. In the month of March, that's when I started noticing. It may be they gone viral, but the timing definitely feels suspicious.
Fair enough. I'll give you that. Like, I think it's a great point, and thank you for pushing me on that. I agree. Yes, it is a bit suspicious.
Well, one more symbolic development. Chiang Kai-shek's great-grandson recently moved to Hangzhou in
Yeah.
mainland China as his family seeks to build ties across the Taiwan Strait. So, how might this move influence discussions of Taiwan's identity and its future relationship with Beijing?
I
So,
mean,
Doug, I'd love you to kind of clarify who Chiang Kai-shek is and his role in
right,
Nationalist Party.
right. Okay, thank you for that. So Chiang Kai-shek is a very, very important person in Chinese history, but also Taiwan history, right? And so if you think back to this period that I was mentioning in the beginning of our discussion, China was for thousands of years viewed itself as the most powerful nation on earth, and really up until the fall of Emperor Yongle in 14, or the death of Emperor Yongle in 1424. I mean, back at that moment in the 1400s, China was the a third of the entire global economy. It had the largest armada. It was the most innovative place in the world where you saw great things like paper and the printing press and gunpowder, things we often attribute to innovation in Europe. These came out of China, right? And so then China built walls and sort of kind of looked inward while Europe was rising in colonialism. And eventually, China suffered a terrible, terrible period that began with the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. And it was in Chinese, it's called the Century of Humiliation. And it was just a dark period. You saw the Sino-Japanese War, which was a war of terror. And, for Chinese people, it was very, very strange to think about this little island nation to the east of China, literally in Japanese in China, in the Chinese language. Japan in the Chinese language means the place where the sun rises, right? So just this little island off the East Coast. And suddenly, the next thing you know, in 1895, they're beating China in a war. And it was a devastating war. But again, this led to a lot of things that happened, the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, the warlord period. It was a very messy time. And it was during this time that Chiang Kai-shek rose to power, right? And Chiang Kai-shek was just a part of the Chinese political context during that time. But he rose to power as a real somebody who was viewed as giving strength back to China, right? And he became the leader of what was called the Republic of China. The Republic of China was supported by the United States and the Allied powers in World War II. And again, we saw horrible things happen in that period in World War II. We saw Japanese invasion of China and the rape of Nanking in 1937. Um, and actually, my own school, you may know, Christine, the Thunderbird School of Global Management, a little group called the Flying Tigers were trained there on the Thunderbird Airfield in Glendale, Arizona, and they actually brought Chinese people over to Glendale to learn how to fly air fighters. And so, there was just these parts of this war that were deep connections. But Chiang Kai-shek really emerged as a leader during that time period, and he led the Republic of China. And eventually, Japan was defeated, as was the rest of the Axis powers. But Chiang Kai-shek emerged as the leader of China. But then there was this popular movement in China led by a leader named Mao Zedong, and he led the communist movement. And from 1945 to 1949, there was the Communist Revolution in China, where the communists fought the nationalists. The nationalists were backed by the United States and other allied powers, but it was primarily the United States. And eventually, that war was lost. And instead of just laying down their arms and saying we were defeated, they went to occupy the little island of Taiwan, which is, 18 miles across the Taiwan Strait. It was for, most of Chinese history, it was a part of Fujian province. But then when the nationalists under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek went to occupy that island, and there was a really interesting kind of critical moment here, because the nationalists had lost the war. They left and they went to occupy the island of Taiwan. But they still claimed because the world had just fought a war against the Axis powers, which were in part against the communist movement, particularly in places like Russia, but also, I guess, eventually in China. The nationalists still had the support of many, many powers in the global political economy. And so the United States, for example, for a long time, supported Taiwan very, very lucratively for Taiwanese people. And so it was just always a strange period. And so then you have this period from about 1949, up through 1979. Well, I guess Chiang Kai-shek died in 1975. And his heir apparent was his son, Jiang Jingguo. And so he became the next president of China, and then that kind of continued on. And then again, we saw Deng Xiaoping coming to normalize relationship with Jimmy Carter. But then the Taiwan Relations Act, U.S. Congress decided we were still going to support Taiwan militarily. And so, it's a very, very complex and long history, but that family is a very, very powerful name in China. And it's a powerful name, not just as the leaders of the Republic of China that went to occupy the island of Taiwan, but also a group that wanted unification. Right. And so they're different from the successor party. So you have the nationalists in China that were led by Chiang Kai-shek, and then you have the emergence of the Democratic Progressive Party, which I believe emerged as a party, correct me if I'm wrong, Christine, but it was around 1989, because I remember those, the very, very raucous things that were happening, and I was in Taiwan at the time. When the new discussions were happening about the nationalists versus the Democratic Progressive Party.
So DPP was founded in 1986.
Okay.
Well, a couple of things. Well, obviously, I grew up in Taiwan until 12. So instead of Chiang Kai-shek occupying Taiwan, it was retreating to Taiwan.
Right.
So our history book certainly offered a different perspective. But thank you for kind of explaining that. So going back to Chiang Kai-shek's great-grandson going to mainland China, it is a symbolic move, isn't it? Like, it doesn't really mean anything because as a family, this is now the fourth or fifth generation. They're no longer in politics. In fact, Andrew Chang's two other brothers are designers and artists. So they're no longer in politics. So to me, this is more of a symbolic move, but it gets covered in the Chinese media quite a bit.
Well, yes, 100% agree with you, and thank you for any other corrections that you have about my narrative about Taiwan, because you know that history.
Well, it's different perspective, not different wrong narrative. It just,
Yeah.
it was a different perspective. I had eye-opening experience when I came here, studying U.S. history, and then talked about the World War II, and then everything was so different from what I learned
Right.
in my history book back in Taiwan. So,
Right. But to your question, yes, this is largely symbolic. I've been doing as much reading as I could on this because it captured my attention. And as I understand it, he sort of posted something on social media, but he hasn't. And he says, "I need to go pursue my career in the mainland," but he hasn't said what his career is going to be. And so, like, I think that's sort of an interesting thing too. Now, it's interesting that he's moving to Hangzhou, right? Because Hangzhou is one of the very, very, it's the home of places like Alibaba. And
but Chiang Kai-shek is from Zhejiang, the province.
He is. But
yeah,
again, like, I think there's a very strong sort of symbolism of his moving to Hangzhou. Like, this is the heart and soul of like the new economy in China. And so I think it's going to be fascinating to see what he does. And I don't think there's any thought that he's going to, get involved in politics. Some of his older people in his family have been like mayors of Taipei and things like that. What I read, he doesn't have any aspiration like that. But I think to your point, like, this is a major symbolic move. Like, I think it's a really interesting thing that this person from this family is, thinking about, like, relocating in his family's Laojia, which is, Zhejiang province, his old home.
So we talked about U.S. We talked about China's declaring ready for any kind of war. Let's talk about Taiwan. Taiwan's president is taking a tougher stand against Beijing. Taiwan's president Lai Ching-te. Doug, what do you make of this shifting tone, and how might it shape the broader U.S.-China dynamics? Can Taiwan actually rely on the U.S. these days?
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting question and an interesting moment, Christine, to really think about this. I've talked about this someone we've talked specifically about TSMC. And so, here I am after a long career journey, and I'm back teaching at Arizona State University, where my grandfather was a professor, decades ago. And here we are with TSMC. Again, I would be clear about this. Like, I think there are a couple of different major players in the semiconductor microchip industry, but TSMC is among the biggest and most important, right? And, they have fab sites in many places around the world, including in places like Nanjing in China and other places. But their investment in the United States so far has been following the CHIPS Act investment of 6.5 billion incentives put out by the Biden administration. TSMC has invested about 65 billion in the building of their three new fab sites there, and they've just recently made the case of committing another 100 billion, right? So this is major stuff for the Chinese economy, for the Arizona economy and for the US economy. And if you want to have tariffs that create impetus for us to rebuild manufacturing supply chains in America, wow, this is a great example of that. Now, there are people, as I've kind of worked with different players in this space and talked to a number of different experts who are quite nervous about the issue of let's not step over any boundaries here. Like, it is very important to remember that Taiwan is a part of China, and yes, Taiwan is an independent economic system and, fully able to operate independently of China and has many allies around the world. But let's just all kind of keep our hats on and kind of keep calm about this. But to your point, in the last year, Lachingda's rhetoric has been quite different. It's been really different about this question of like, well, maybe the time has come, and maybe, Taiwan is independent, and we are independent of China, and we are an independent economy, and it's been some pretty provocative stuff. In addition, this happened in the context of the war on Ukraine, right? And so, the fact that and the extent to which countries like the United States have supported Ukraine, the Ukraine on, you know, militarily and financially in investment in military issues, I think has raised people's questions about like what would happen if, this rhetoric got really provocative by President Lai, and then, Beijing's building, putting aircraft carriers in the Taiwan Strait and perhaps going to even show its power by building a blockade. This gets really messy really fast because, it could happen that there is a declaration of some sort. And, in my view, as you and I have discussed previously, I don't think President Xi is going to let that happen. I just don't think he's going to allow for the world to continue to go down this track. And so I think the showing of military force is real. And I think that this is a time, as you and I have just discussed briefly, this is a time for moral leadership. This is a time for good diplomats to get in the room with people and not try to flex their muscles through bluster about tariffs, and really, really talk quietly about what it is that we need to be doing together, how we can support each other, how come we can continue to walk down this path where, we're not sending aircraft carriers across the Taiwan Strait, and we're not building economic blockades, and we're all in this together. And so I think it's a really important time, but it's scary. I'm worried.
Well, President Lai of Taiwan seems to be concluding that China will probably limit its action against Taiwan, while Beijing is really stressing about the escalating trade war. So this is the opinion of David Sachs, a fellow at the Council of Foreign Affairs who monitors Taiwanese affairs. So he's really betting that China's focus on economic war and would leave Taiwan alone. And I think that's why he's taking harder and harder stands right now. Um, so to me, it's a very dangerous game. So
I believe it's very dangerous, and I think those who are, again, there are plenty of people who think that the U.S. is the largest economy in the world, and we hold the cards here, and we can have tariff wars if we want, and China's going to back down. And as you and I have discussed, I just think that that's a misreading of the circumstance. I think first, it's a misreading of who's in the position of power, and if China wanted to have a significant impact on tanking capital markets where many Americans' 401ks are tied up, they could do it. If they decided that Apple and Tesla and Walmart were no longer going to be able to operate in China, it would be devastating for global capital markets and devastating for Americans' 401k plans. But the bigger issue is just, I think, the continued commitment and identity to this issue. Yes, you have a complex we're all interrelated and closely tied economically, but China will not back down from this, in my view. If something it comes about and President Lai, kind of ups the rhetoric and wants to see what would happen and wants to see if the U.S. is going to come defend Taiwan in its quest for independence, this is not going to end well. And so it makes me very nervous.
thanks, Doug, for
Sorry.
unpacking. Thanks for unpacking these critical developments. I'm getting more and more nervous. Its evolving dynamic truly deserves our full attention and will undoubtedly shape U.S. China relations and regional stability. So, well, thank you so much for today's discussion. As always, we value your support and engagement. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. And remember, starting next week, we'll begin our new series, Global Lens, Conversation with Professor Doug Guthrie. We're excited to continue these critical conversations with you now with a broader insight into global affairs and leadership. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me, Christine. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.